Okay, this is a lecture to introduce you to the major theories of international relations. And so, even though the Intro to International Relations course is not a prerequisite to taking the human rights course, it's still important to understand the major theories of IR. So let's start by trying to define international relations in general. So first of all, one might define it as the study of the mechanism for fair and equitable allocation of scarce global resources among its very unequally powerful actors. Okay. And that seems to be a reflection of a more liberal perspective. The second definition is the IR is a systematic study of the behavior of relations among nation states, plain and simple from a realist perspective. So here we have for you the introduction of two of the major theories of IR. Realism, which is the oldest theory, and its traditional counterpart is liberalism. A note here, by liberalism and liberals, we're not referring to liberals in the United States. So don't think that this is the same thing. We're talking about the liberal theory of international relations. And so we have different elements of the definitions that we need to talk about. One is nation states. States tend to be one of the major actors in the international system. So think of the international system as this big nebulous cloud on a blackboard, if you will, with states being represented by boxes. Okay, and so for individuals who adhere to a more realist perspective, what happens inside those black boxes seem to be less relevant than what's really happening outside the box. Okay, so if we have these black boxes, there's one, well in this case they're red, this is box A and box B. What happens within these boxes, that's domestic politics. And for realists, these things that happen within the box isn't as important as the relationship between the two states vis-a-vis the international system. And here's the big cloud of the international system. Okay. And obviously there are some smaller states populating the international system as well. Okay. Very crude and rudimentary drawings here, but you get the idea. Okay. And so each of these states have some resources, and these states are powerful but probably not equal. If power is simply demonstrated by the size of the box, states A and B are much more powerful than all these other states represented by these other boxes. So who gets most of the resources, and how is that activity, how does that activity occur? So liberals want to study the mechanism, that is the way that these allocation of scarce global resources, oil, forests, water, how they are divided up amongst these powerful actors. For realists, it's a systematic study of the behavior of relations among nation states. And so for realists, what happens between these states is most important, between these states and these states. For liberals, there's other actors, not just nation states. So there's multinational corporations. There are IGOs, that is intergovernmental organizations like the UN. There's NGOs that are important, like Amnesty International. There's individuals that might be important, Osama bin Laden, for example. There are terrorist groups that are important. So there's lots of different actors for the liberal perspective. For realists, the most important actors are states. All right, so that's a very brief introduction. Let's move in to talk about theories in general. When we think about just in general, what do we mean by a theory? Well, a theory is going to do several things. We want theories to describe political phenomenon. Okay, so realists describe how states behave. Realism and liberalism also are going to explain how particular states behave in certain situations. But more importantly, we want them to predict, will this happen in the future? Okay. So a theory is a set of prepositions and concepts which explain phenomenon, describe it, predict it, by actually specifying relationships among certain types of concepts. And this is going to lead to hypotheses. Okay. And so we want this theory to be basically a simplified representation of reality. We're not trying to explain why World War I occurred, for example. We want to explain why do wars occur. We might use World War I as a case study, but we're interested in the phenomenon of war and coming up with hypotheses about why does war occur. And these hypotheses tend to fall into a phrasing such as, countries that are resource scarce tend to go to war more often than those who are resource flush. Right? Countries that border one another are more likely to go to war than countries that don't border one another. Things like that. In the human rights field, we want to know, why do some states violate the rights of their citizens and other states not? So, for example, hypotheses might be the more democratic a state is, the less likely they are to violate the rights of their citizens. That's a hypothesis. We need a theory to explain why that's the case. Why do we think that states that are democratic are more or less likely to violate rights of their citizens than others? And we can talk about what that theory would would include. There's an explanation, a description, and a prediction of why we think that's the relationship. So we want to test these hypotheses to see if we can verify a theory, and then find out if there's any new relationships through theoretical development. All right, well, let's focus again back on realism and liberalism for a moment. Okay. The focus is on the international system, as I drew in that box for you before, where you have this cloud with all these different actors in it. All right. So the focus is on things beyond the state, the external factors. Okay. And so we're really looking at the international system. This is the level where most of the major IR theories are functioning or studied at. Okay. So think about the black box analogy, that those states are black boxes and those states are unitary actors. Okay. And so in the system, we can think of different types of relationships, and we can boil those down into two. There's conflict and there's cooperation. Conflict is the dominant theme in realism, and cooperation is the dominant theme in liberalism. Let's look at our cartoon. Here we have President Bush building a missile defense system that he says is going to ruffle a few foreign feathers. So at first we have Russia pointing a missile at us. All right? He doesn't care, and you see more missiles. And he then says we can't forget our main objective, and that's to feel safer. And all of a sudden you have a lot more weapons pointed at you. Well, does this make sense? Yes, it makes sense in a system of anarchy. So this is a key term, anarchy. Anarchy, most agree, exists in the international system regardless of your perspective. So if we think of anarchy, think of the Wild West or frontier days in the United States. As you moved in your covered wagon westward, you only really had yourself as a defense. So you had to arm yourself. You had to arm yourself against the elements, you had to arm yourself against the animal life, you had to arm yourself against the indigenous population, and so you had to feel safe. In order for you to feel safe, you had to arm yourself. It's not that different internationally. It refers to the idea that there's no one world government. Don't fool yourself into believing that the UN equals one world government. The international system is chaotic. It's unpredictable. There's no legitimate international law enforcement mechanism. I'm not saying that there's not international law. There's no legitimate international law mechanism for enforcement. So states violate international law all the time, just like individuals violate domestic law all the time. All right? So this anarchy leads to the security dilemma that's played out in this cartoon. It's a self-help system. I can't depend upon a one-world government to protect this country, so I have to arm myself. So the situation exists where one state, here, the United States, improves its military capabilities, its defense, for example, and those improvements is seen as a threat to our adversary, Russia. So each state in this international system, this anarchic international system, tries to increase its own level of protection, leading to insecurity in others, and obviously the arms race. So the security dilemma is a result of fear, insecurity, and a lack of trust among states living in an anarchic international system. So states arm themselves in order to pursue the rational goal of self-preservation. But by arming themselves, more fear and insecurity is created among states. And this is the crux of what happens in the international system. And so realists believe that conflict is inevitable, so we have to arm ourselves. Liberals tend to believe there's ways to overcome this security dilemma through cooperation. Okay, so here is a slide that kind of very simplistically outlines the realist and liberal paradigms. And paradigm is another word for theory. So for realists, the key is the relative power of states. What is my power as a state relative to another state? Okay. And again, back on the first screen where I drew those wonderful boxes for you, if the size of the box is the power, then relatively speaking, A and B have equal power. That would be a bipolar system that I drew for you. Okay, and so this bipolar system is going to influence how states act. So the larger states can act very differently than smaller states. And so the power leads to a constraint on how states are going to act. And this is going to influence the overall stability in the system. Liberals tend to focus on some institutions like those IGOs and NGOs that I drew and on shared power. And they argue that this helps states overcome the barriers associated with the security dilemma and is going to lead to cooperation. That in fact states learn to cooperate through iterative relations. So over time, if they cooperate on one element, they're going to continue to cooperate, particularly in the economic sphere. Okay? So if we think about the major theories of IR, we can talk about realism and liberalism, and I just want to outline a few elements about those theories and then say a few brief things about some other areas, some other theories that are used extensively, particularly in the human rights field. All right, so if we think about realism, the focus of analysis of realism is really the struggle for power among states in that anarchic international system. So the major actors are states. The behavior of states is that they're rational. They engage in rational behavior. That's not to talk about being crazy or not, rational in the economic sense, that states are rational with their ordered preferences and they choose those preferences that's going to provide the best utility. And they're unitary. A unitary actor simply means that the United States acts as one unit. We can domestically squabble all we want, but we project one decision outward. Okay? The key concepts, if we think about realism, the security dilemma, balance of power, power politics, anarchy, a self-help system, kind of think of a Hobbesian view of the international system. Okay? The strength of realism as a theory, it's simple, it's straightforward. There's historical evidence to support the theory. It's the oldest theory, reaching back into Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. The weakness, if we want to describe some of the weaknesses of realism, there's an argument that there's too much emphasis on conflict, that underestimates the role of international institutions in promoting cooperation, and there's too much emphasis on nation states, and it cannot account for peaceful change. And that last critique might be its strongest because realism cannot explain the end of the Cold War. For most realism, the way you shift power in the international system is through warfare. And so the end of the Cold War, from a bipolar world to a unipolar world, if only for a short period of time, is not explained very well by realism. All right, well, what about liberalism? The focus on liberalism is enhancing global political and economic cooperation. So liberalism has a strong economic component. The major actors not only are states, but NGOs, IGOs, multinational corporations, for example. And liberals are going to argue that states are not always rational actors. They might engage in activity that may not seem rational, but it helps to provide a compromise to help overcome the security dilemma. And so the compromise occurs between various interests within the states. So liberals might dive into that black box to see if there's cooperation occurring amongst different institutions within states, that cooperation extends to those same institutions in other states. So the goals of the state is economic prosperity and international stability. And again, they also see that in terms of key concepts, that the international system is anarchic, but there's ways to overcome that. So IGOs, international law, collective security, regimes, interdependence, human rights, those are all key concepts from the liberal perspective. Okay. Of course, there are some strengths and weaknesses of liberalism as well. And the strengths are that it is much more inclusive in terms of the different factors that make up the international system. The weakness is that there is perhaps some naivete on the part of liberals about how the system works in terms of national security being the ultimate goal of states. And so when push comes to shove, states are going to do what's in their best self-interests. All right, there's a few other theories to mention briefly, and one of those is constructivism. This is one of the newer theories of international relations, and it asks questions about the nature of the state, the concepts of sovereignty, the concepts of identity, the concepts of citizenship. And so it looks at also the roles of gender and ethnicity. And so it tends to ask different types of questions. And it supposes or it proposes that the concepts of power, the concepts of states that realism and liberalism tends to focus on are not fixed or not objective. Instead, their meanings are constructed through social interaction. What that really means is that we bring meaning to objects, not the other way around. So state conduct is shaped from a constructivist point of view by elites' beliefs, their ideas, their identities, their social norms, and these relationships and state conduct is not shaped by power or the way the international system is constructed. Okay? So individuals matter. And so if we think about the concept of anarchy, what you'll hear most often when we think about constructivism is the phrase, anarchy is what states make of it. This is a very famous phrase from a leading constructivist, that anarchy is what states make of it. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the states believe that anarchy is going to lead to a security dilemma, then it will. If states believe that anarchy can be overcome by cooperation, then that will occur. So instead of having issues and concepts drive state behavior, constructivists argue that we bring meaning to state conduct and not the other way around. If we think about some of these key actors, just like we did with the other two theories, the key actors for constructivists are people, elites, and culture. They believe that the individual is a key component in creating the meaning of ideas and concepts, that states are an artifact that is socially constructed through a discourse, through language, that the international system is also socially constructed. Okay, and so it's kind of a much more nebulous theory that some students have a harder time grasping. So just think of constructivism as driven by ideas and how ideas can change, and so international relations and international behavior can change. Of course, then you have feminism as a major theory of international relations. Feminism is an interdisciplinary theory, not just related to IR. And the focus of feminism is on gender and how gender makes a difference in how states behave and the relationship between states. And there's different levels of discussion when we think about feminism. So there's not only the idea that IR is driven by males who traditionally studied international relations, but the things that are studied within international relations are gender biased. And so this is why there's much more focus on war, for example, than there are a focus on women and children, for example, and how war might impact those citizens. Okay. And then Marxism. Marxism is a theory that has been pretty debunked, if you will, but it still holds an important role in describing and explaining how states evolved over time. And Marxism focuses on class, domestically about the different economic classes, but internationally about the differences in states in terms of their economic structure. And so Marxism has a lot to say about the developing world and the relationship between the developing world and the developed world. And this is important to issues of gender, just like feminism, and issues of development that affect certain types of human rights, which will be important. All right, that is a very brief description of the major theories of IR. If you are still struggling with with differentiating between these theories, I can provide some readings or some other types of information that might help with these ideas. You will not be asked questions specifically about realism or liberalism on the midterm, to the extent that you're going to be asked to define what those terms mean. And so keep that in mind. And anytime that theory is brought up in the other sections of the other modules, then I'll be sure to point out what elements of those theories are really important.